So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, the SSB special dialogue series session that we have. And this is a session that we jointly collaborating with the CPA Australia and also CAANZ. Today's topic is about how to navigate accounting standards. And I think many of us would think that accounting standards are getting more complex because the business transactions is getting more complex, the economy is getting more complex, and how standard setters respond to that is to coming out with a set of accounting standards to address those complex issues as much as possible. In 2022, the SSB and ISB received some feedback from the stakeholders asking the standard setters to do some work improving the understandability of accounting standards. And the SSB also has started its portal, that is a system to help stakeholders to navigate the web page to find what they are looking for. So today we are going to go through three topics. The first topic is that we're going to have Janice Loftus and also Sabine Schreier to talk about the research reports about the understandability of accounting standards. And then we'll have Ram from the CPA Australia, Michelle Warren from HLB to talk about their launch of a guide about navigating accounting standards. And we also have Clark from the SSB to show us how the SSB portal can be used to find the information that you are looking for. So perhaps I'd like to now start with the research reports produced by Janice and Sabine. So perhaps, Jad, would you like to share the screen while I'm introducing Janice and Sabine? So Associate Professor Janice Loftus is from the University of Adelaide, and she's a fellow of CPA Australia. She has published in a wide range of international and Australian accounting journals, including a recent article in Accounting and Finance on the topic about understandability of accounting standards that is co-authored with Brian Howison and also Sabine. Janice has co-authored several textbooks on financial accounting and is the lead author of Financial Reporting, which is in its 4th edition. She is a member of the SSB's Academic Advisory Panel, a long-standing member of the Executive Committee of the Financial Reporting Interest Group of the Accounting and Finance Association of Australia and New Zealand, and an associate editor of the Australian Accounting Review. And we also have Sabine here. Sabine, she used to be an academic in the University of Adelaide as well. She is now a research fellow at the University of Adelaide Business School and a principal advisor at the Australian Department of Treasury and Finance. She has extensive experience in public sector accounting and accounting standard setting, having previously worked across federal and state governments in Australia, including for the Australian Accounting Standards Board and the South Australian Auditor General, as well as a lecturer at the university. She has researched and published in accounting and reporting topics, including the recent article in Accounting Finance about the understandability of accounting standards with Janice and Brian. So Janice and Sabine, I'm going to hand over the presentation to you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. I will start off our presentation and then hand over to Janice later. So first I would say welcome to everyone who is listening in to this webinar, and I would like to thank the AASB for giving us this opportunity to research and present on this topic. And I would also like to acknowledge that Janice and I are presenting from Ghana land, and we pay our respects to the traditional people and custodians of this land, to their elders past, present and emerging. As a disclaimer, as usual, the presentation, the research are the views of the researchers and not necessarily those of the AASB or our employers. So our task was to investigate whether the way in which IFRSs are developed, written and presented impacts on the ability of the users of those standards to comprehend their meaning and requirements. So I would just like to emphasize that this is really about the understandability of accounting standards, so not of the financial statements. And I would also like to say that understandability is different from readability, and I'll go into that shortly. Next slide, thanks, Gia. So the motivation for this research was that users of accounting standards have commented on the complexity, as Eric already mentioned, of accounting standards, and the standard setters are taking note of this feedback. So there's the IFRS, the ISB have projects on understandability, and also the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board has a project which is called Complexity, Understandability, Scalability, and Proportionality. And we thought, we don't know whether that's really off to a good start considering that title with respect to understandability. But essentially, the objective really is to take on that feedback from stakeholders and to investigate ways in which accounting standards might become more accessible or more understandable. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first, I would like to clarify what we mean when we talk about understandability. And in the context of accounting standards, we understand that that means to be able to comprehend and to consistently interpret the meaning and requirements of accounting standards. So this is definitely separate from readability. So readability, we might be able to read a sentence. That doesn't mean that we understand the sentence. And understandability is subject to multiple factors. So Farrell in previous research suggests that there are some factors that are specific to the reader and some that are external to the reader. So specific to the reader would be things like intellectual ability, education, attention span, etc. Whereas other things are external to the reader. So for example, the size, style, and color of a font, but also the register of language that is used. So, are we using technical, academic language or conversational or legalistic language, for example? Next slide, thank you. So there is not a lot of research in this area on understandability of accounting standards. Haswell has investigated complexity in accounting standards, which of course, as Eric mentioned before, complexity is very closely related to understandability. And Haswell looked at this in the context of the ISB and the FASB working together in sort of the early 2000s. And he was investigating whether merging or working together would lead to less complex accounting standards. But essentially what Haswell argued was that on both sides there were complexities, and for example, the FASB is a more rules-based set of standards, and then merging it with an ISB principle-based would not necessarily be easy and go well. He found that there are principles and rules across both standards, definitions in different standards, there was inconsistency, and the different definitions were sometimes not clear or muddled or vague. So, and essentially Haswell also argued that he didn't think that working together would necessarily lead to less complex standards, but actually the opposite. There is a body of literature also that looks into readability, and in our recent paper that was published this year with Brian and Janice, we picked up on the readability and found that really all Australian accounting standards, according to a readability score, are very difficult or difficult to read. And that might not be news to most people here in this room, but essentially what we then argued was that, okay, we know that standards are difficult to read, but some standards are a bit easier to understand, or there's a perception out that they're easier to understand compared to other standards. So How should we go about investigating this? So what we did was we interviewed people that we thought worked with accounting standards. So the standard setters, but also preparers and auditors. And then we asked them to identify who they thought users of accounting standards were. And essentially they all identified the same: preparers, auditors, academics, and regulators. And we also found that the interviewees agreed that there was increasing complexity in the standard, and that was partially due to an acknowledgement that the landscape which accounting standards cover are more complex. Typical example, the financial instruments accounting standard, or the insurance accounting standard, which are just very complex because the underlying products and transactions are very complex. One of the things that we found, and the irony didn't get lost on us there, was that those standards that were raised as the most difficult to understand, such as financial instruments and insurance, had a comparatively low readability score, higher readability score, which means that they were easier to read. So it was actually contradicting the readability versus the understandability. Next slide, thank you, please. So then to deal with the increasing complexity and issues with accounting standards, we found that the interviewees suggested there are different coping strategies. So they relied on a variety of sources for their interpretation. So for example, they would go to the basis for conclusion, which people found very helpful. But at the same time, people also said it's only a very small percentage of the users who actually go to the basis for conclusion. They also relied heavily on Big Four accounting firms or technical teams, if they had them, in larger corporations, or used guidance in the public sector that is provided by technical teams in treasury and finance departments. So there is this, this reliance on an interpretation of the accounting standard that breaks it down. And another thing that was mentioned as a finding is that people relied on flowcharts and really appreciated flowcharts in accounting standards. They also liked examples, but recognizing with the examples that might be a bit complex, because sometimes examples might be taken as rules rather than simple examples. And also examples that were provided in the accounting standards are pretty basic and couldn't really cover the more complex issues. Next slide, thank you. So the prior research that we did was Australian-based, and after we presented that research, the AASB asked us to extend our research to an international audience. So for this research project, we focused on talking to standard setters primarily, or people or individuals who are heavily involved with the standard setting process to start with. What we did was we interviewed people that we were familiar with or that were facilitated by the through AASB contacts first, and then asked those people whether they had any suggestions who else we should interview. So we used a snowball approach. And as you can see, we've interviewed today 23 people across a wide range, a geographical range. And it was really valuable to hear from all these different areas. So we interviewed standard setters. In some jurisdictions, the professional bodies have the standard setting function covered as well. So they count as standard setters. We spoke to some people from the very large Big Four accounting firms, and then 3 from professional bodies in countries where there is no standard setter, and the professional bodies might adapt this function maybe a bit informally. Thank you. And now we'll hand over to Janice to discuss our findings.
Thank you, Sabina. I'm just going to go through a few of our key findings. to do with the accounting, the principles, the use of examples, the language used in the International Financial Reporting Standards, and also issues relating to access to materials. So starting with the principles, there are different views about whether principles-based accounting standards are going to be easier to understand, whether having more principles-based is easier to understand, or whether having it more rules-based would be easier to understand. The concerns with around the principles were that they are not explicitly stated sometimes in the accounting standards, or that they are stated but not stated very clearly. Also, another issue that arose was the tolerance within International Financial Reporting Standards of the inconsistency with the conceptual framework principles. And in some cases also the inconsistency between the principles in the accounting standard and some of the rules that were included in that accounting standard. So people were concerned about the dual task of trying to figure out what the principles were, and then having to sift through and find out whether there were some exceptions to the application of those principles in particular contexts. So we did see some differences of opinions about whether principles made it easier to understand, or whether it made this accounting standard, being principles-based, made it easier or more difficult to understand. Next slide, please. There were some limitations or criticisms or concerns raised about the use of examples. The examples were often criticised as being too plain vanilla, and that was something that was echoed our earlier study that was Australian-based. But internationally, we did find the same concerns, that they didn't cover enough transactions, enough contexts, or that they were too simple. In fact, sometimes almost assuming away the judgment that needed to be made, when in fact the purpose of the example might have been perceived to be to illustrate the exercise of judgment, but then the transaction was overly simplified, and so there was very little need for judgment on that. So that was another concern. There wasn't enough complexity, or that the situations and the context that the examples were based around were not representative of some of the applications. So in some jurisdictions, the local context, the types of transactions that people were entering into were not really represented adequately in the examples in the International Financial Reporting Standards that they were applying. And there was another concern about that the difficulty of the examples, the use of examples in standards, keeping pace with the rapid change in commerce and in practice, in the nature of the business operations. So trying to keep the examples current was a challenge as well. However, there was certainly some tension there, because the contrasting views were that there's a danger of having too many examples, overusing examples, or the examples are too specific. They may be unable to be applied to different contexts because they become too contextual, or that there is an over-reliance on examples so that the examples become quasi-rules. Next slide, please. The use of language was a common concern amongst the participants, that they are simply not in plain English and not in everyday language, with some describing them as the elite, the conversation among the elite, the technical experts. Some more specifics there were the inconsistent use of terms, or the terms that were not defined, such as ordinary activities not being defined in IFRS 15. The Meanings may have changed over time, which can be a challenge, so that they become inconsistent between accounting standards that have been developed over a very long period of time. And the use of some double and in some instances triple negatives, and I recall that issue was more around around IFRS 9. There are also some general translation issues, because going to an international context, we have a lot of users of accounting standards for whom English is a second language, and so there was some difficulties of translating phrases and terminologies, and there was an example there of fair value, that although the definition may be translated, the definition of fair value is maybe relatively easy to translate, but then how do you give it a label? How do you give it a label that is something different than the definition without having some different connotations in another language? And there's also the issue of access, because the English language abilities varied across jurisdictions, and in some cases, because in some jurisdictions there are multiple languages, and so it is not in the language that the first language of the accountant is trying to apply and interpret and apply the accounting standards. Next slide, please. Thank you. And lastly, if I could talk about access. Now, in some, if we think about the earlier findings of our first Australian-based study, there were a lot of coping strategies around using things like the basis for conclusions, using materials that were made available by large accounting firms, by in-house departments in public and private sector, and also for treasury and finance interpretations and applications and guidance books. But in some jurisdictions, then these resources are not widely available. Not everybody has access to the basis for conclusions, which has been drawn upon to understand the principles in the accounting standard. They're not always available for education purposes, so the accountants are not getting the training that they in interpreting the accounting standards. And of course, then there may be less of the private materials available, and also they're not often available they're not translated. So for people trying to apply the accounting standards in a different language. Just one thing I would like to acknowledge, though, that where translated international financial reporting standards are available, the respondents from a number of different jurisdictions and referring to different translations did express that the quality of translations was very good, very high quality translations. But the issue is then in some sort of general translation issues that arose, and also the education of the local accountants. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, what would enhanced understandability look like? What would more understandable accounting standards look like? We would recommend that the principles in the accounting standards should be clearly stated and perhaps more prominent in the accounting standard. The use of flowcharts has been found to be very helpful. The use of examples is also helpful, but again, with caution, we need to be avoiding the examples becoming quasi-rules. But when we're talking about making accounting standards more understandable, then it's really two sides of this. As pointed out in the introduction by Sabina, that there are two factors that influence the understandability. There's the document itself, how it's the style of writing, the use of language, how the content is presented, but also the reader. What is factors that influence the user or the reader of that document. And this is where there, I think, is a lot of opportunity for further education, education of preparers, but also education of those, like myself, tasked with educating accountants. And this could be at a university level, but also, of course, professional development as well. So we'll, next slide, please. Just like to thank everybody for their attention, and I'll hand over to for any questions.
Thanks, Sabine and Janice. A question for you. I think you mentioned in your presentation that the financial instrument standards and insurance standards, you were saying that the readability is high, meaning that it's easy to read, but it's difficult to understand or difficult to apply?
Yes, Eric. So in the original research that we did, it's exactly as you said. So for example, accounting standards that were perceived to be easy to read are some of the, I'd say, older ones, property, plant and equipment, for example, well-established practices, and, probably dealing with something that is a little bit less complex. Whereas those that we found that were difficult to understand in our research were those newer standards, particularly financial instruments, insurance standard. I think, Janice, the revenue standard as well?
Yes, just the what made these standards more difficult to understand was the complexity of the language used, and the instance of rules and exceptions, and the fact that they were dealing with complex topics as well. So they are inherently complex, but also quite difficult language, particularly with the use of double and triple negatives, which was a bit of an issue with, in particular, with the financial instrument standards that people mentioned. There was also another matter that was raised about them not being entirely principles-based, and that once you worked out what the principles were, then you had to work through what exceptions would apply. And that was standard was one, IFRS 9 was one that was where that issue was mentioned as well. So it is a combination of the inherent complexity of the subject matter, the complexity of the language, and the need to figure out what those principles were, and then whether they were going to be applied or whether there was exceptions. And another point that was raised, and this is coming through some of the more recent standards, a few of them, and 15 was in this category as well, 15 on revenue recognition, that where the accounting standard required more exercise of judgment, that this was where it was found more difficult to understand. So these were the things that were affecting the complexity of and the difficulty that preparers had in understanding the accounting standard, which is not necessarily going to be reflected in a readability score. That said, none of these standards were found to be easy to read. That they were varying, between, difficult and very difficult to read. So it was a matter of ranking, and none of the accounting standards were coming up as an easy read.
Okay. Now, thanks, Janice and Sabine. One of the points I like about our presentation is mentioned that there's a small percentage of people go to the basis for conclusions, but they actually find that the basis for conclusions are helpful for their understanding of the accounting standards. And when I tie that with your recommendations, you also mentioned that the education is needed for stakeholders so that they can navigate how to read the accounting standards better and find the information that they want to find. So with that, I'm gonna move on to the next part of the session. I'm going to invite Ram and Michelle to talk about a guide that the CPA Australia has launched and published recently. And before that, I'm just going to very quickly, briefly introduce Ram and Michelle. So Michelle Warren is the Director of Financial Reporting at HLB Manjart in Australasia. She has spent over a decade in external audits before making financial reporting and technical accounting as her focus. She is now responsible for many technical matters at the HLB Manjart. She enjoys breaking down the complexity of accounting standards and finding practical solutions through collaborative problem solving. And we also have Ram here, who many of us are familiar with. He's the Senior Manager of Reporting and Audit Policy Team at the CPA Australia. He's been involving a lot of work with the CPA Australia, including policy making, communicating key messages on financial reporting and audit matters to finance professionals and other stakeholders. He has had extensive experience working in the public practice sector in the UK and also in the technical advisory services of a major professional accounting body in the UK. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation to you, Ram and Michelle.
Thank you, Eric. Michelle and I are going to play a bit of tag team on this one. So we're going to share the responsibility of firstly launching the guide that you've just mentioned, and of course presenting some of the aspects of the guide as well. If I could request the next slide to be put up. Thank you. So why did we do this guide? And before I jump into that, I should probably make a slight distinction between what Sabine and Janice spoke about as part of their research and what this guide is about. So Janice and Sabine talked about the issue of understandability of accounting standards. And as we understood it, understandability is a quality that accounting standards possess. So it's something that is inherent within the accounting standards. This guide does not try and address that particular issue. It is more about navigating the accounting standards and providing a bit of a primer in how someone goes about in reading and understanding various aspects of accounting standards. So that's where this guide comes from. And one of the reasons why we did it is, of course, the issues that Janice and Sabine have spoken to. And that was one of the key drivers in why we thought this guide would be a good document to put out there, particularly to assist preparers and, of course, students who may choose to enter the accounting profession. The second reason why we did it was something you mentioned, Eric. The IASB and, of course, the AASB have both consulted on what they should be doing in the future. And one of the things that the IASB in particular decided to focus on as part of their last agenda consultation was to look at the issue of understandability of accounting standards. And they even indicated that they were going to allocate about 5% of their resources towards that particular topic. So we thought as professional bodies and of course with HLB Manjat on as a partner, we thought how do we support or assist with that? And that's how we decided to do this guide as well. And the third issue was member feedback. Both the professional bodies, the policy teams that I'm part of at CP Australia, and of course the equivalent over at CINZ, we get technical queries. And quite often these technical queries are around how to navigate accounting standards. And I'll give you an example. Quite often we get issues around scope. So which standard to apply? And of course, when you're looking at which standard to apply, the issue revolves around the scope of a particular standard and whether it's applicable in those circumstances or not. I recall an example of a particular issue that we came across a few years back. I think it's back in 2020. It was around the issue of casual labor and a particular court case that was going on at that time, and the potential for providing for past payments made to an employee or a casual labor employee. And the question was around, should we apply AASB 137 or AASB 119? And that depended on whether the person in question was considered an employee or not. So we had to actually prepare some guidance around which standard to apply in which circumstances. So both AASB 119 or AASB 137 could have been relevant depending on whether the person was considered an employee or not. And the provision had to be made in accordance with either standard. So that was one of the reasons why we thought it would be helpful to assist in identifying different parts of an accounting standard and then looking into how to read those different parts. If you could perhaps provide the next slide, I'll pass to Michelle on that one.
Thank you, Ram, and hello to everyone that's joined us today. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the guide. And I guess considering the importance of accounting standards, especially when it comes to their consistent application, and that's to ensure robust and credible financial reporting systems, the people applying the standards should have a solid understanding of things like the fundamental characteristics that underpin the standards, how the standards are structured, where to go when looking for particular information or guidance within a standard. Also, what other related materials support the main accounting standards, such as the basis for conclusions. It's very pleasing to hear that it is known about, even by a small proportion. But very often these other materials that support the accounting standards, they often contain very useful information when trying to decipher accounting requirements. So the guide is very much focused on explaining these types of aspects related to accounting standards. So as you can see on the slide there, the content is divided into 7 sections, starting with the fundamental attributes of accounting standards. So this section explains the key attributes on which accounting standards are built. And having a good understanding of these fundamental attributes is really a good starting point when trying to decipher accounting standards. So for example, understanding that accounting standards are principles-based, well, should we say mainly principles-based, as opposed to rules-based. Understanding the role that professional judgment then plays in interpreting and applying these principle-based requirements to specific facts and circumstances. Also the concept of transaction neutrality, which some standard setters, such as the AASB, use when developing standards. Section 2 covers the conceptual framework. So its purpose, as well as key elements of the framework that really underpin essentially all accounting standards. So while the conceptual framework isn't itself an accounting standard, it can be a useful reference when trying to decipher accounting standards because it explains the fundamental building blocks or concepts used in developing accounting standards by standard setters. The third section of the guide, this explains that there's helpful guidance and information that sits outside of the standards themselves. And as we've heard this afternoon, very often preparers of financial statements aren't always aware of these other bodies of literature. And I suspect it's mainly the techos that know about and refer to these. But section 3 explains what these other bodies of literature are and which are mandatory, meaning they must be considered when preparing financial statements, and which are non-mandatory, meaning that they aren't authoritative, but they can be helpful in applying a standard. Section 4 covers the different types of accounting standards. Really, there's 3 main categories. There are transaction-specific standards, such as AASB 16, the LISA standard, which we all know and love. There's presentation and disclosure standards, such as AASB 124, the related party disclosure standard. And then there's also industry-specific standards, such as the new insurance contract standard, AASB 17, which became effective for the first time this year. Section 5 is all about the structure of an accounting standard. So this is the section that breaks the standard down into its main parts, and it emphasizes that all standards, while they cover a variety of topics, they are structured in a very similar fashion. So it explains that standards generally start with an objective. So what is the standard trying to achieve? As Ram has already spoken to, there's a scoping section, which is a really important section to read when you're trying to figure out which standard am I in, so that you end up applying the appropriate requirements in the circumstances. Of course, there's paragraphs dedicated to recognition, measurement, disclosures, transitional provisions, and the section explains a little bit about all those paragraphs. It also makes reference to appendices, which make an appearance in standards, especially the newer standards, and these appendices do form an integral part of an accounting standard. Section 6 and 7, these provide some information regarding the standard setting process at the international level and how this trickles down to local jurisdictions such as Australia and New Zealand. So Section 7 also explains where to find certain local accounting standards, for example, the Australian accounting standards, for which a link is provided to the AASB's website. And on this point, I'm aware people like to Google accounting standards, and I'm always telling our staff, don't do this, because the risk is that you end up landing on an outdated or a superseded standard. So I'm always saying, my advice is always just go to the source of truth, in this case, the AASB's website, and get your standards from there. And Clark will speak about the AASB portal and how to navigate your way around there very shortly. So that's a high-level overview of the guide. Personally, I hope that it makes accounting standards a little less daunting. I sometimes find there's a reluctance to open accounting standards. People would rather try and solve a problem by Googling. And this does work in many cases because there's so much written content out there. But I guess one way to get more comfortable with reading accounting standards and realizing they aren't that bad is to just keep on referring to them. So next slide. Oh, no, actually, I don't think. Ram, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Stay on that slide.
That's all right. I'm very conscious we are running slightly behind, so I'll probably quickly whiz through this and pass back to you, Michelle, for the last slide. What this guide is not is it will not support interpretation because it's only about navigating the standards and all the various elements that make up the accounting standard. It's probably important to remember that other documents which are part of the framework have started to take a life of their own. So these days we hear about agenda decisions on software as a service being quite an important issue. It's not a standard, it's an agenda decision issued by the IFRS Interpretations Committee, but of very important relevance to preparers. And there's basis for conclusions, as Sabine and Janice spoke about earlier. The low value asset threshold for leases sits in the basis for conclusions for AASB 16. So other documents do have importance, and it's not just about the main standard. So what this guide is not, it's not about interpreting the standards. That's entirely a responsibility of the reader in applying their competence and professional judgment. And of course, as Michelle said, there is an expectation that readers will commit to understanding the standard by reading it cover to cover, especially with the later standards like AASB 15. You really can't Google and find the answers for that particular standard. You've got to read it from cover to cover to understand what revenue recognition is all about. And lastly, the guide does not tell you how to understand economic phenomena that sit behind a standard. And I think that's a common misconception that can come up sometimes, where readers actually think that by reading a standard, they can understand how leases work. So by reading AASB 16, you can actually understand how the economic transactions for leases work. That's not the case. You've got to understand how a lease transaction works first before you come to understanding how to account for it. So this guide does not pick up on that either. Next slide, please, Eric.
I think that's us. That's us done.
That's us actually. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ram. Look, it's such a great initiative. It's being done by the CAANZ, CPA Australia, and also with Michelle. Great collaboration. One question, when will the guide be released and where can it be found?
Okay, so the guide has actually been released as of yesterday. So I know that it's up on the CPA Australia website. If someone navigates to our tools and resources and financial reporting page, it sits there right on the front page. I'm expecting, unfortunately, my colleagues from CANZ couldn't be here today, but I'm expecting that they would have uploaded an equivalent version of that or up on their website as well. But it's definitely up on the CPA Australia website. I can confirm that.
Great, yes. So because there's a question from an attendee asking, he was mentioning he can't find the guide through Google. What we can do is perhaps the AASB may also include it in our newsletter this week, so that any attendees, if you receive our newsletter this week, you should be able to get the information about the guide. Great. So now I'm going to move on to the next session. Thank you, Ram and Michelle, for explaining what the guide is and how attendees can find the guide. So let me first introduce Clark. This is important because the next session is going to be very, very exciting. I think many stakeholders have been asking the AASB how to use the portal. And today we have real demonstration from Clark, who is leading the project on the AASB portal. So Clark has worked in accounting standard setting roles in Australia, the USA, and the UK since 1987. His current principal responsibilities at the AASB concern accounting standards related projects, particularly public sector projects, climate-related financial disclosures, and publication and regulatory matters. Clark has been involved with many areas for many years, including implementation issues through the former Urgent Issues Group, and a total of 8.5 years as technical advisor to the Australian member of the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, IPSASB. Prior to becoming a standard setter, Clark worked for a predecessor firm of Ernst & Young in auditing, technical, and education roles, based in Melbourne, but also with experience in Singapore and Indonesia. So Clark, would you like to share your screen and show us how do we navigate ourselves through this AASB portal, and perhaps explain how is being useful for our stakeholders?
Very good. Thanks indeed, Eric, for that introduction. It's great to be with you all today to show you the fruits of our labours over the last 18 months in the AASB Web Pronouncements portal. This was developed on the basis of the Auditing Standards Board portal, so we thank them for going first. We've been live since August last year, and for those who've seen it before, the bright red beta version banner was finally removed in July this year, so that was a great outcome. There are two ways to open the portal. What we're looking at presently is the home page of the AASB website. So for those who've been using it recently, you'll be familiar with the tile here, which has a link to the portal. So this tile has been here since August, but the message in the middle has been changing as we've been developing the portal. We have recently added a further link under the Pronouncements tab right at the top to the web portal. So you don't have to go to the home page if you're already using the website to open the portal. Open the portal here. Thank you for the instruction. So this is the home page of the Standards portal. You just scroll down, you'll see that we have the Australian Accounting Standards on top, presenting a list by numbers. Most helpful, of course. But this portal also provides interpretations, framework documents, conceptual frameworks, that is, statement of accounting concepts, practice statements, and board agenda decisions. And these are also in a numerical order. And you can open and close those links as you wish. So looking back at the standards listing, you'll see this is the choice to list by number. We also have a choice to list by theme. And this is really designed for those who aren't all that familiar with the standards and aren't sure where they should look. General topics. Okay, thank you very much. Let's have a look at the third page, because general topics takes 2 pages. TU2 disclosures, the applicability statements, which standards or which T is relevant, financial instruments, groups of entities, specific activities, public sector, and the very last, the special topics, which we figure most people won't need to use at all, or perhaps only very rarely. So that might help someone locate the particular standard that they're looking for. There is also a link under each of these accordions to pronouncements by period. These links are also reached by the links across the top of the page. So you can see, again, the 6 types of pronouncements. So let's just click on Accounting Standards. And you should see that we have come to what we call the period landing page. The staff have set the 2022-23 financial year as the current specified financial year for presenting this landing page. So all of the versions on this landing page apply to that financial year. All 6 pages worth, the last, of course, AASB 1060. So the staff can reset this at an appropriate time. So perhaps in a month or 2, we might set this to calendar 2023 to assist those who are addressing financial reporting for the 2023 calendar year. The next button for future periods is really to help those who are looking ahead beyond the 2022-2023 financial year. Now, the caution is that these are versions that apply only to periods later than our currently specified financial year. So, for example, AASB 1, this version applies to periods beginning on or after 1 January 2023. So, of course, it does not apply at all to the 22-23 financial year. Our third section here is familiar to those who've used this function on the existing website. You can specify your own reporting period, click the apply function, and as required, those standards listed will change to the ones that are relevant to your reporting period. So that's a very powerful function if you don't have a regular financial year. Whilst we're on this page, I would like to show just these links to all versions. So this is simply a listing of all the versions in the portal of the particular pronouncement. AASB 1, I must say, our most amended accounting standard, and frankly, the least used or perhaps never used these days. But here we have from July 2021, 5 versions of AASB 1. So if you want to look at a list and see the historical development, then this is the way to do it. Let's go back to our financial year listing. What do you actually see when you open a pronouncement? Well, the one I've chosen to demonstrate is AASB 10. And just in case you forget, this is AASB 10 in big font. Consolidated financial statements, and most important, the operative date statement. So our financial year beginning 1 July 2022 falls into this operative date statement. So this is the right version. You can see at the top right, we have a download link for the PDF file if you want to use the PDF file. The central panel here is the most important part of the portal. We have a brief introduction to the standard in case you're not sure that this is the standard for you. If you know the paragraph number you want to look at particularly, you can jump to a specific paragraph by entering the number here. Let's just open the first section, preamble. Well, this is the basic information that you see at the start of all of the compiled versions. So that's not the most exciting part of the document. Let's open the objective. Well, we see something a bit different here. Let's click in paragraph 1, and you see immediately that a little copy function pops up. So if you click on as text, that will copy the text of this paragraph onto your clipboard, which you can then insert in a Word document or somewhere else. Gone are the days here of trying to copy text from a PDF file, which we know doesn't work too well. Alternatively, if you click on direct link, you'll get a hyperlink that you can then insert into your Word document. So if you're writing a memo to your director or the board or whomever, you can include the text or links to these particular paragraphs with ease. Now, there's a lot of links included in these standards, which is really the bonus from this portal. If we choose to say, well, here's a defined term, consolidated financial statements, what is the definition? Well, click on that definition and it opens the definition for you in the right-hand side. So you can then read that definition alongside the text within which that definition is referred to. Here we have a link to the conceptual framework. So this is a different pronouncement. If we click on that pronouncement, that link, it opens the pronouncement in another window. Let's go back to AASB 10. You don't have to do it this way, it's just that the Zoom functions cover this part of the portal screen that I need to use. Never mind. We're in the objective. We have the definition of consolidated financial statements open. Here's a cross-reference to a paragraph in another standard, a paragraph that defines reporting entity in 1057. So we can click on that link and it opens it at the right-hand side. Paragraph OS 1.1 of the conceptual framework opens in the right-hand side, and you still have the tiles available here for what you've previously opened. And we can open all these others like this and go back to the previous ones. So in fact, the portal permits you to have 5 of these review panels open, and the earliest 2 beyond that are retained in the memory. So you can actually retain links for 7 items here. So we can close that individually, or we can choose close all to close all of them. So we think that's a very useful approach, because if we look at, I've just opened the scope section to look at the wonderful paragraph numbered AusCF Aus 4.2, must be the worst in the entire standards, I think. This is about an ultimate Australian parent presenting consolidated financial statements, except if the ultimate parent is required in accordance with paragraph 31 to do something else. Well, where's paragraph 31? Well, I could go down and find it, but in fact, it's so much easier to click on paragraph 31. There it is. And it says, oh, wait on, except as described in paragraph 32. Well, let's click on that. And here's paragraph 32. And if you have a big enough screen, you can use float to move these parts around so that you can see your basic text that you started with, paragraph 31, and then paragraph 32. And so this is designed so that you can see all the different parts that you need to look at on the screen without having to move from one screen to another. So let's just dock this one back to the right, and we can close all again. So we think that's a very helpful function with the portal. I'll just scroll down to Appendix B. Well, all of the information in this section are the headings from Appendix B. So if you're not quite sure where to look, you can look through these headings to see what you want. Now, perhaps a future development, we might be able to click directly on these headings to get where you want to go. In the meantime, you can go to the left-hand side and the table of contents. Now, this table of contents has all the headings in AASB 10, the paragraph numbers as well. And so you can select the heading that you're looking for, or indeed, as we were looking before for paragraph 31, here's paragraph 31 under this heading. If we click on that link, it opens and hide that. It opens to paragraph 31. So the table of contents is interactive and enables you to move around the document more conveniently as well. The other important feature, I think, to show everyone is the right-hand side has links to useful documents to help you understand the content of AASB 10. So there are 5 types of documents that we have attached to the right-hand side. I chose AASB 10 because it presents 4 of them. AASB interpretations that are relevant to AASB 10 are linked here as well. Now, these open PDF files. Perhaps a future update of the portal might actually open in Interpretation 5 in the portal itself, and that page would give you a choice for a PDF file. ISB extras, because we don't have copyright permission to publish these to the world, you have to be in Australia to be able to see these from our website. So these link to the AASB website, the support materials page. Scroll down, we're looking at AASB 10. Here's the basis for conclusions, here's the introduction and so on. And click on that to get to the document that you want. Okay. Sorry, I have to go back. We also have linked to IFRIC agenda decisions, which are becoming more and more important. Again, we've made the decision not to link to each one individually because there are so many, but it's only 3 clicks to find the list. 1, to get to our website page. Scroll down, AASB 10. Here's the link to the IASB's website. Scroll down, IFRS interpretations, agenda decisions. So with the 4th link, with the 4th click, you can open the version that or the agenda decision that you want to look at. Back to AASB 10. AASB extras are the bases for conclusions that are attached to a compiled version. Now, these are presented as PDF versions on the grounds that we didn't think people would refer to them terribly frequently, and so they're not actually within this central section of the standards. But they are linked, identified in the central panel in this way, but the links are at the right-hand side. Eric, permit me a little bit longer. I'm going back to the home page, which is click here, or in fact under our logo, because we now do have a better search function than is on the current AASB website. So given the time of year, everyone's interested in income tax, so let's search for income tax. So this search tells us that there are 45 pronouncements in the portal that use the search term income tax in any paragraph. So you can click either on the left-hand side to open the pronouncement or the right-hand side to open the paragraphs concerned. And so on this page, you can then open paragraph 3, either from the left or right. So it moves you to paragraph 3, and there we see tax and income tax. So we think that's going to be a useful approach to the search for particular terms. Let me just go back into that. The other part of the search is to search for the search term within definitions. And so 19 definitions have been found across the pronouncements, which include the search term income tax. And again, you can use links on either left or right to review the complete definition. With both of these searches, you can also use a filter to say, no, I don't want to look at everything, I just want to look at interpretations. Or indeed, you can specify the reporting period as well and click on update to modify the search results. The only other part, Eric, that I'd like to present just at the moment is we're in the process of developing our and loading the mending standards to present as well. We have a number of them already just for the demonstration. So this is the all versions listing of WSP 112, and you can see that there are references here to links to amendments. So following the approach of the current website, we provide the subsequent amending pronouncements with a version. And if I click on the next one below, you can see that this version was amended by 2023-2 for periods beginning on or after 1 January 23 that end on or after 30 June 23. So this version, which applies to periods ending on or after 30 June 2023, is the version that incorporates 2023-2. But this version itself has been amended by 2023-4 just 3 weeks ago. And so the version that incorporates those amendments isn't yet, well, in fact, we haven't done the compilation, and so it's not yet included in the portal. Let me stop sharing at that point, Eric. That's a very quick rundown of the features of the portal. I encourage everyone just to have a bit of a play in the fiddle and see what parts of it they can find most useful to the issues that they're dealing with. Thanks, Eric. Back to you.
No, thanks, Clark. That's certainly very helpful. We've got a question from the attendees. Will the portal be updated certain fixed times of the year or whenever a new pronouncement is issued?
That's a good question. We want to keep the portal as current as we can. So, for example, at present, we have 5 more versions of accounting standards to load that apply to periods beginning on or after 1 January 2023. So we've been loading those over the past 3 months, and we've got 5 more to go. So it's not going to be periods when the portal's updated. We're going to try to keep it as up to date as we can.
Okay, thank you, Clark. There's also a question being asked earlier at this session, asking how there can be common affiliations as standard setters and large accounting firms. I think the question is asking why standard setters ask for feedback and advice from large accounting firms, and some people are having concerns that large accounting firms may have too much power and influence in the process of accounting standards and make it much more complicated and complex. But I think we need to be clear on this. That is, in order for the standard setters to develop high quality standards, standard setters need to gather inputs from all stakeholders, not just large accounting firms. And so standard setters are actively engaging with all stakeholders, regardless what industries you're from, what sizes of entities you're in. Standard setters are interested to talk to preparers and users, and such as investors. So there are many people that standard setters need to talk to in order to be informed. And you may ask the question then, why standard setters need to get views from the large accounting firms? Like other stakeholders, large accounting firms may share different perspectives on accounting issues. And in particular, these firms have dealt with complex accounting issues that are important for the standard setters to consider. And that's why standard setters need to also involve large accounting firms as part of their standard setting process. And just want to reiterate, it's not just a large accounting firms that the standard setters work with, but also a diverse range of stakeholders. Is there anything else panelists would like to add to the same question? No.
I just think that the question was in the context of our list of participants in the interviewees for our research study, and it was exactly as you say, that it was a person who was both a board member of standard setting board and engaged by a large accounting firm.
Okay, thanks, Janice. Okay, so we also got 2 more comments about there's this attendee very happy with the portal, especially the cross-referencing. Thank you for that feedback. And Clark, how do we get feedback from the stakeholders if they have any suggestions on what their portal experience is?
Yes, thanks, Eric. At the bottom of each page on the portal, there's actually a feedback link. So that invites you to provide specific comments, your email address, and you're allowed to request a response as well. So yes, plenty of ways you can respond to us on the portal. There is also a link on the homepage as well. So I look forward to hearing how you're using it and what you think we might do with it next.
Thank you, Clark. Okay, I'm conscious of time. It's now 5:15. It's at the end of our session. So to finish this, I'd like to big thank you for Janice, Sabine, for giving us an insights from your research perspective. And I would like to hear more findings from the WSB Understandability of Accounting Standards project. And thank you, Ram and Michelle, to present the guide that is a collaboration between the CANZ, CPA Australia, and also Michelle, yourself, as one of the authors of the guide. And the CANZ has shared us the link to the guide. Again, we'll share that through our WSB newsletter. And I also want to thank my colleague Jia to put this event together so well together. Thank you very much, Jia. And thank you everyone to attend the session. The next dialogue series will be happening in November. The topic will be about materiality. So again, a very hot topic at the moment. So when we get more information, we'll share that with everyone. Thank you so much for your time and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.